Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kimberly Roa Tejera. I am the Special Projects Coordinator at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College and your host for today's afternoon Tertulia, Labor, Politics, and Knowledge in Puerto Rico. This event will have Puerto Rican Sign Language provided by SEBA interpreters and simultaneous English to Spanish interpretation by Babilla Colectivo. Joining us in conversation today are author and professor Jorell Meléndez-Badillo and Centro Research Associate José Laguarta. José and Jorell will be discussing Jorell's latest book, The Lettered Barrida, Workers, Archival Power, and the Politics of Knowledge in Puerto Rico. After this discussion, we will turn over the floor to the audience for a Q&A, so please submit questions to the Q&A function. And with that, I turn it over to Jorell and José.
Thank you, Kimberly. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being with us. Saludos, Jorell. Bueno verte de nuevo. And I want to also thank our great interpreters from SEBA Interpreters and Babilla Colectivo Babilla for their wonderful job as always. So, Jorell, first of all, primero que nada, felicidades por el libro que tengo aquí, The Lettered Barrida, Workers, Archival Power, and the Politics of Knowledge in Puerto Rico. Tú lo tienes ahí también. It's out in print now, so folks who are interested can go and get it from booksellers, preferably direct from the publisher, Duke University Press. Así que muchas felicidades, Jorell. Gracias por estar aquí con nosotros y acceder a pasar este ratito aquí con nosotros en esto que espero que sea una conversación lo más amena posible. I hope that this will flow as much as possible like a conversation rather than a panel presentation or even an interview, although I do have a couple of questions for you that I would like us to talk about. So first off, let me start by saying that I think that this is a very important book, which is groundbreaking in many ways. Two of the ways in which I think are the most important ways in which it breaks new ground in the historiography of the early Puerto Rican labor movement are, first of all, in its intersectional approach. I think this book, the narrative that this book establishes is quintessentially intersectional because one of the things that it does is to explore those silences, especially in terms of race and gender, in the archive, right, that Puerto Rican workers or members of that early workers movement built during those first few decades of the 20th century. So even as they were fighting for space and for a voice for themselves that was denied by the local elites and by US colonialism and imperialism, they were also to some degree reproducing the very same discourses of those elites and excluding and silencing certain voices. And Jorell, I think, does a wonderful job of centering those voices that, as much as possible, right? Because one of the problems is the traces that are left in the archive, by, for example, people like Juana Colón, who is, to me, is sort of the most important figure in the book, who was illiterate, right? She could not read or write, and therefore she could not leave those traces herself. But then the question becomes, why didn't others, right, sort of write her into that history? And that's one of the things that I hope to talk to Jorell about. So that's one of the ways in which I think the book is groundbreaking. It's also groundbreaking in its interdisciplinary, right, approach, I think, even though it's not so much a history of the early Puerto Rican labor movement, and Jorell, correct me if I'm wrong, it's a historiography. It's about how that history was written. But it also borrows quite a bit from other disciplines, right? The anthropologist, the late great Haitian anthropologist, Michel Rolfe-Trouillot, for example, figures prominently in some of the theoretical and methodological discussion. So Jorell, could you speak to some of those points a little bit more? What do you think, what drew you to this project? Why don't you start the conversation there? What drew you to want to do this and write this book in the first place?
Super. Primero que todo, mil gracias Can you hear me well? More or less. I apologize for that. You hear me now? Super, excellent. So thank you, Josiang, for the invitation. Before I delve into answering the question, I just wanted to say thanks to everyone involved, Kimberly, Camacho, the interpreters, and everyone here with us today in this conversation that we hope to open later on for everyone to participate in. Josiang, again, thank you for the invitation and for those comments. It's a great honor to hear you talk about the book in that way. And so to start answering your question, what drew me to write this book, I think there are multiple intersections that got me to writing this book. At first, I think that it starts with, you know, that rebellious punk in me, teenager that was part of a community that really fostered the idea of DIY, do it yourself. And so I was interested first in the histories of anarchism in Puerto Rico, and I thought that there was a silence in Puerto Rican historiography in terms of anarchism. It was present, but more like a footnote in that 1970s historiography. And so I began thinking about the history of the working classes through there. Also, because of my own upbringing, I come from a working class background. I was raised by my grandfather and my grandmother, who had a fourth and sixth grade education. They also great. Sorry about that. So it also, it was part of trying to grapple with my own history, the history of my grandparents. And so I started that book on anarchism that I wrote really got me thinking about working class intellectuals and working class history. And as you mentioned, I was thinking a lot about Puerto Rican historiography, not so much about the history of the laboring masses, but the historiography behind it. And one of the things that I noticed is that people like my grandparents were absent. So I began the project thinking about working class intellectuals, but very quickly it changed after I had a conversation, which I documented at the beginning of the book, with one of my family members, in which they told me that my great grandfather was a scab, era un rompehuelga, and that quickly changed my view of history, because I was trying to write a history that honored my family members by focusing on the most radical segments of the working classes, particularly because of my own politics. But what I failed to understand was that my family members were the people on the other side, the rompehuelgas. And so it got me thinking about why people like them were absent. And so that began an exploration into working class knowledge production, both the ways that workers at the turn of the 20th century were thinking about history, the power of dominating not only the means of production in a classic Marxist sense, but also the means of working class knowledge production. And through that domination of the means of working class knowledge production, they were able to silence folks like my grandparents, not only people like them, but also people like Juana Colón, who gave her life for the laboring masses, for the organization of the Socialist Party, yet she's absent from the narratives that a handful of obreros ilustrados that imagined themselves as the interlocutors of the working classes crafted. And so those were the things that I was trying to think about when I was writing the book. And just as a note, the cover is actually Juana Colón, and that's a poster that was made by Kelvin Santiago, who is a militant of the PCP in the 1970s, and now is a sociologist and an important figure within Puerto Rican studies. So I think that to summarize what got me to this book, it was my politics, it was my upbringing, and trying to grapple with the absences of first anarchists. And once I did that, grappling with the absence of people like my family members, those that were non-unionized, non-skilled workers, non-urban workers. And so quickly I found out as I was writing the book that race, gender, and unskilled workers were erased from this working class narratives that were built at the beginning of the 20th century, but that still carry enormous transhistorical power nowadays.
Wonderful, thank you, Jorell. So staying with this experience that you eloquently narrate in the, I think it's the acknowledgement section of the book, right? And that you've brought up again for us now, and it's interesting. I think I've had some similar experiences that I would love to talk to you about one-on-one at some other point, sort of, you know, having political commitments before learning about elements in your own sort of family, right, background. It can be, I mean, that can become a sort of a formative experience as well, and clearly it has for you in terms of shaping this project. At the same time, right, you know, and I think it's pretty clear from talking to you and from seeing this book, you know, we maintain those political commitments that we have that we had already sort of assumed. So staying with that thought, and to be just maybe a little bit provocative, can we or should we talk about the exclusion of folks like your family who were rompehuelgas or scabs, as is the term that is commonly used in English? Their exclusion, can we put it in the same bag as the exclusion of someone like Juana Colón, for example, who, as you say, actually gave her life for the movement? And I bring this up because for, you know, those of us who do have certain political commitments and who are used to reading about the labor movement, you know, in a sympathetic light, right? It can be a little disconcerting to sort of think about, you know, that other side, as you say it, as you mentioned, and sort of bringing that other side to the center, right? And then so what happens to the political content of the struggle, and sort of trying to understand that these are struggles within struggles, right? So what do you think about that? I mean, Rompehuelga and Juana Colón, do we value them historically in the same way? How do we make sense of that? How do we disentangle that?
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Jose. I think that question of exclusions for me is crucial and very important. And in part, I think I would start answering this, and I don't have a concrete answer, but I'll think with you as I answer the question. I think that in part, one of the things that I wanted to do with this book was to demonstrate how oftentimes knowledge that gets produced in the margins reproduces the logics of the center. So in terms of oftentimes, you know, after the 1970s and that turn in the historiography of history from below, the worker as a subject of study entered the university, entered academia. And so it was the first time that people began thinking not only about mythical figures within the labor movement, because we've had labor histories since the beginning of the 20th century, but it was a time in which sociologists, historians, anthropologists began thinking about workers or the worker as a category of analysis and of study, right? But one of the things that I wanted to demonstrate is that even though those workers had been marginalized by the Puerto Rican elites, they created margins within the margins. And so that was one of the things. I was trying to look at the hierarchies that had been produced in the margins. And so in a sense, the book is not a history of the labor movement, but it's a history of the politics of knowledge and how those things were negotiated within the working classes, right? And so I think you bring an important point in terms of not all exclusions and all silences are created equally. And so there are different, and so this is through Yo, once again, you know, silences enter the historical narrative at different points. He identified 4 different points when the silences enter the narrative, but I think that people like my family members were erased because they did not fit the idealized male, white, urban, skilled worker identity that obreros ilustrados valued. Juana Colón was excluded for another set of reasons. She was excluded particularly because she was a woman, because she was Black, because she was illiterate. And so those silences and erasures took place in a different sort of realm, although she gave her life for the Socialist Party. And this is an important point because in the book, I demonstrate that Juana Colón, when she passed away, in her will, I don't know if she left a will, but one of her last wishes was for her coffin to be covered by the Socialist Party's flag. And so I make the comment in the book, this is the same party that excluded her from the historical narratives they built. Still, the party carried power, it carried enough power and importance for her and illiterate women that gave her a space in her, political sphere that she wanted to be buried with the Socialist Party's flag. And so her exclusion was different. And so we can talk later about Juana Colón, because I think it's a fascinating case also to think about counter archives. But I also, in the book, there's another example that I bring with Juan Vilar, an anarchist from Caguas, who was also excluded from the historical narratives that these obreros ilustrados built. And I argue in the book that it's because of two things. He was an anarchist at a moment in which the labor movement, particularly dominated by the American Federation of Labor, wanted to push a reformist agenda and de-radicalize the movement. So he was challenging the labor unions through his radicalism. And second, he was Black, so he participated in a silencing process and in the creation of an archive that had no space for him and eventually ended up erasing him. And Juan Vilar is also really important because as he was dying, literally dying in poverty, I found a series of letters that he wrote to some leaders of the Federación Libre de Trabajadores, including Santiago Iglesias Pantin, who was the president, in which he was saying, why has the Federación Libre abandoned me when I needed it the most, right? And so his exclusion was not only rhetorical or in terms of in the narrative that they built, but it was also in real life. He died in poverty, and he died like a martyr on May 1st, 1915. So that's really, for me, a really powerful case to think about exclusions, to think about the ways that silencing operates. So ultimately in the book, that's one of the things that I wanted to understand is the ways that power operates in the production of knowledge. And so it's in two ways, right? Historiographically, grappling with Puerto Rican historiography from the 1970s onwards, but also with the historical narratives that they themselves wrote at the beginning of the 20th century. Because one of the things that I want to do in the book and in my own thinking is to take them seriously. Some of them saw themselves as historians, as poets, as littérateurs, and so I take them seriously as producers of culture and knowledge. And so I'll leave it at that, but thank you, because I think it's important that to acknowledge that not all silences are produced, like there was no one size fit all, but people were excluded and silenced and erased from the narrative because of different things tied to their own particular identity and lived experiences and whatnot.
Absolutely, thank you for that, Jorell. Very powerful indeed. Those examples of Juan Vilar and Juana Colón, who I want to come back to, because again, to me, she's sort of the center that kind of ties the book project together. At least that's how I read it. I don't know if that's how it is for you or how it is for other folks. I mean, certainly she's on the cover, right? That's her sort of leading the masses in that wonderful poster by Kelvin Santiago Valles. Let me switch gears here a little bit, because one of my other favorite aspects of the book is your use of the barriada itself as a metaphor, right? Which you borrow the term lettered barriada from the Uruguayan author Angel Rama and his notion of the ciudad letrada, juxtaposing thereby the workers' archive, the barriada, to that of the elites, which was the lettered city, using Rama's terminology. But the metaphor to me is useful in other ways, right? Not just in the mirroring. And the lettered barriada mirrors the lettered city in more ways than one, because it's also excluding and silencing voices. But beyond that, right, you beautifully sort of describe a barriada in a way that I think only somebody who has been in a Puerto Rican barriada can, right? Highlighting their spatiality, their materiality, the narrow passageways, how they resemble the veins of a cardiovascular system, how they were kind of works in progress, with the alleyways added to create spatial unity as the housing was built. And then, the lettered barriada came alive through the nexus of literary production and print culture, political participation, and labor rituals that reconfigured social and physical spaces. Newspapers became its alleyways, books became its houses, and social studies centers were its public plazas. And indeed, that's how you structure your first chapter, right? You talk about the newspapers or alleyways, the books as houses, and the centers as the plazas. And so that metaphor and that use of metaphor I thought was really great, and it stuck with me. And so I just wanted you to talk a little bit more about your own lived experiences. As I understand, you grew up in a barriada in Aguadilla. You mentioned that in the acknowledgements as well. And so maybe reflect a little bit on how lived experiences also shape, the metaphors through which we approach the world in our own kind of intellectual and political endeavors.
Thank you for that, Jose. Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in la barriada Cabán in Aguadilla, Puerto Rico, capital del Caribe. And so, yeah, and so that was, for me, it was important to think about barriadas in relation to Rama. And I'll say a few things about Rama. Rama's book, La Ciudad Letrada, The Lettered City, was highly, highly influential in my own intellectual development. And I came to it by chance. I was actually roaming through the library looking for books by Carlos Rama, his brother, who was a historian and sociologist and had written books on the socialist movements in Latin America and anarchism and whatnot. And I took The Lettered City without knowing what it was. I started reading it. I could not understand it. It took me another 10 years to go back and actually understand it. And so one of the things that Rama was trying to do was to map the urban dimensions of knowledge production and power and how they related, how letters also built cities. And so I have to say that it's a posthumous book, póstumo. He died before finishing the manuscript. And so he doesn't really engage with the working classes until the last part of the book, which he was writing when he passed away. But I felt that the concept of barriada was very useful to think about those in the margins of the lettered city. And so it made me think about all these working class intellectuals that I was reading, that I was fascinated by, which I have to say that, the group of folks that I follow in the book was a very small group. It was a handful of male working class intellectuals that had access to letters, and they understood the power that having access to letters gave them. And so for me, that metaphor was really important. And so when I started writing and thinking about that metaphor, I was thinking about my own barriada, but also the barriadas where my friends used to live. And so not all barriadas were the same. And so one of the things that I also wanted to do was to keep the term barriada in Spanish in the book, because when you think about a translation for barriada, it's usually shantytown, or it's usually poor working class neighborhood, and so there's some connotations that obscure the vibrant life, culture, and intellectual exchanges that happen. Even, I follow there's a Facebook group of my barriada in Facebook, and I see the ways that they cook el lechon on Sundays. They get together, and there's so many knowledges that are exchanged in those interactions, right? And so I wanted to highlight the ways that, although there was a lettered city that operated with great power, And it's a great metaphor to think about not only colonial Latin America, but Latin America and the Caribbean today. I think that it was missing that barriada. And so one of the things that I also think about in the book, but I want to continue thinking after the book, is that this barriada was not exclusive to Puerto Rico. There were similar barriadas operating throughout the Caribbean and Latin America at the same time. So there's a broader world and network of barriadas that were also interconnected among themselves. So those were the things that I was trying to think about with this metaphor of Angel Rama's The Lettered City. I was trying to document those that were outside of the city. But then, and this goes back to the question of silencing, I found out that in La Barriada, there were also silencing folks. And so there are folks that are not inside of the Lettered Barriada because of their own identities and, you know, how they were marginalized from the barriada. So I don't know, metaphorically speaking, where I should locate them, but I know that they're in the margins of the margins of the margins of the margins.
Wonderful. Yes, absolutely. And I think it's a very effective metaphor in terms of thinking about the process of building that archive, and what that archive itself, I mean, what an archive even is in the first place, right? You talk about, you know, the literal archives that the workers built, but you also talk about the ideational archive, right? And so there, that, you know, and by the way, I just want to let everybody know that that it's a really readable book, right? So it's actually enjoyable, and you feel like a little bit like you're going through those alleyways and in grappling with those complexities, like, you know, like you said, you're bringing and centering folks who are at the margins of the margins. And a little while ago, I think I said there's struggles within struggles also, right? So when evaluating, the problem is that maybe, right, that we're a little too used to thinking about history in terms of good guys and bad guys, right? When in fact what there are struggles. That's what there are. And even within the good guys, there's also always spaces of exclusion, and there have to be struggles in order to change that, right? And I think that's what many of the figures like Juana Colón that you bring to the center, you know, as far as they could within their lifetimes did, and then other generations, right? And so this is maybe where I want to veer the conversation now, so that we have time to address questions, right? But you make the point in that third chapter, that wonderful third chapter, which actually covers three figures: Luisa Capetillo, who I at least was familiar with. I think there's some work that has been done on her. Paca Escabilla, I learned about, right? She was a Black laundress who, she was, in a sense, she was an obrera ilustrada because she could read and write, and she did leave a trace, unlike Juana Colón. But I didn't know who she was. I learned about her through your book. And then Juana Colón, I also knew about, right? Even though, in a sense, of the three, she's the one who had the least voice. But I think in part, the reason that I knew about her, for example, is because of something that you mentioned in the book, which is that her figure was kind of rescued, right, from oblivion by the younger generation, right, of socialists, no longer the Partido Socialista of the 1930s, but the PSP of the 1970s, Partido Socialista Puertorriqueño, a different generation of radicals looking for answers, looking for inspiration, perhaps, and looking to foreground some of the, and perhaps even try to remedy some of those silences in the sort of received history that they were given, right? And so Kelvin Santiago was one of those folks. I believe Norma Valle, who wrote about Luisa Capetillo, was also a prominent feminist socialist in the PSP, right? So they're part of that next generation of radicals who are doing that searching, that kind of soul searching, and in doing that, they rescue for us the figure of Juana Colón. So maybe now we can reflect a little bit on that sort of intergenerational aspect of these struggles within struggles that we mentioned, and kind of use that as a gateway to consider sort of the importance of these discussions today, right? In the context of what's going on in Puerto Rico, and in struggles against exploitation and against colonialism that are taking place, as we speak, right? We know that this week there have been some massive demonstrations of the teachers, for example, and other public employees that are getting a lot of traction and public support. In many ways, a lot of the issues that these struggles within struggles were trying to address, and maybe failing, or maybe not addressing everything that they should have, but some of those issues and those struggles against oppression keep coming again and again. So what are not so much the lessons, right? The political lessons, although maybe we can connect some of those political lessons to these issues of archival power and historical memory, and why they're relevant and important, and so on.
Great, thank you, Jose. Yeah, I want to start by picking up something that you mentioned. I think in the segue to this question, and it was that notion of good and evil, of binaries. And so that's one of the things that I clearly wanted to go against in the book. I wanted to go beyond the binary of who's right and who was wrong. And also one of the things that I also did was so one of the readers, anonymous readers, suggested that I made US imperialism the central analytical axis of the book. And I pushed back against that, not because I think that imperialism was not present and that empire dominated social relations and these struggles, but because I wanted to go beyond the binary of the political status of Puerto Rico and see other forms of politics that were happening underground. And so I think that it also led me to desanctify or demystify some of the labor leaders that we have come to veneer as, Ramon Romero Rosa, Santa Iglesias Pantin, Rafael Alonso Torres, all these, very important leaders in their time. But I wanted to go beyond that. And part, I think it goes back to this notion of, my punk upbringing of kill your idols, in a sense, right? And so that led me, that was the framework that I arrived at the book. But I think that thank you for bringing up that third chapter, because that third chapter for me is very important in highlighting what I wanted to do with the book. Actually, when I began writing that chapter was the moment when I said, this is what the book is about. Because I was dealing with those folks that had been silenced. And so I was now dealing with trying to write about the agency of those that had been forcefully silence, and particularly Luisa Capetillo, who, as you mentioned, has been written a lot about, and I even have here as a plushie doll in my office with me all the time. Pacascaví, who we know almost anything. We don't know much about Pacascaví, but she was also an obrera ilustrada, anónima. She, for example, there's a book that was published to celebrate May Day at the beginning of the 20th century, and she has a beautiful chapter in which she begins by citing Leo Tolstoy. So she was also engaging with those things. And Juana Colón, which was an activist, which was an amazing figure. And so I guess in terms of rescuing, one of the things that I say in the book is that I did not want to rescue them, to incorporate them into a working class canon or a working class archive. I was simply using their example to think about power and how they were excluded, and the force behind those racist and heteropatriarchal forms of erasure, right? And so I think that that was one of the things that I was doing in that chapter. So thank you for bringing that up. And so in terms of the people that came before me, you know, I always say that my work is a love letter to the folks of the 1970s historiography, Chuco, Gervasio, Blanca, all these folks. It's my love letter. Although I go against them sometimes, and I critique them, and I challenge them. I tell them all the time when I see them, this is to honor y'all. And I think that Norma Valle and Julio Ramos, who Editora Educación Emergente, now I'm like doing promo here, just published Amor y Anarquía, a re-edition of his very important 1992 book. They had already been thinking about Luisa Capetillo. So in the book, I bring Luisa not to write a history of Luisa, but to use Luisa as an example of how she needed to navigate this world dominated by men. And so the complications of that. And so I think it's very important what you also mentioned about the PCP, because the PCP and the original Socialist Party, founded in 1915, was completely different. One favored the annexation of Puerto Rico to the US. El PCP was more of a radical independentista tradition. And I think that, however, the PCP did an amazing work in trying to unearth these stories. And so one of the things that I do in the book, and you know, Juana Colón, I was not the first person to study her. Wilson Torres in ay bendito, in what's her hometown? I'm blanking on. Comerío, a historian of Comerío. He had written about her. Bianca Medina had written about her, but the first people that actually wrote about her were PCP members in dialogue with community folks that had created a street counter archive of Juana Colón. And so I think that's important, and I don't want to extend too much, but in terms of that transhistorical dimension, I am very interested in transhistoricity, which means being in dialogue with folks in the past, now in the present. And I think that there are a lot of parallels and similarities. And so when I began writing this book, it was a moment in which El Partido del Pueblo Trabajador was beginning to have conversations with Movimiento Victoria Ciudadana, and there was a coalition in the works. And so it reminded me of the 1932 coalition between Republicans and their class enemies, the Socialist Party, and how it was successful, but it ripped the party apart. So I think there are lessons there to think about that. And also in terms of what's happening now, I think that I always think about all the archives that are moving in those protests. And I think of all the banderas rojas that are, you know, circulating as paper in those protests, and thinking about how a historian might think of what's happening right now in Puerto Rico and how we can save those pasquines, those, you know, banderas rojas, those, you know, Abayar de Rojo, all those publications to document that in the future.
Absolutely. No, and that definitely comes across in your discussion. So thank you for that. I also think, I mean, not just in terms of, like I said, the political lessons, but you know, we need to be wary of the pitfalls of archival power, right? And so that's definitely something that we can learn. You know, in the discussion of the contemporary labor movement, I have conversations with folks who are surprised to see all this militancy coming from the teachers, and it's like, okay, the 2008 strike never happened. That got erased. You know, not for racial and gendered reasons, but for political reasons. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot there in that sense. The book is a wonderful tool that you have given us, and I hope that that many generations of activists and scholars can make use of it in that way. So we have a series of questions, and I want us to be able to address them all. I'm gonna read them out to you. And what do you think? Do you want to take them one by one, or I think there may be 4 or 5. So
yeah.
Bueno, pues vamos con la primera. Daisy Aguilar Guzmán asks, is the term working class intellectuals a common term or one created by you?
Thank you for that question. No, so I did not create the term working class intellectuals. I think it is used commonly in labor historiography to talk about working class folks. However, I think that it's also in dialogue with organic intellectuals, which is a concept of Antonio Gramsci, right? That classes produce their own intellectuals. And so in the book, I do engage with another term that I did not create. It was actually created by the folks I study in the book, which is obreros ilustrados, which would translate to something like enlightened working men. And so that was the way that they would address themselves as, and that they understood themselves as. And so I began using obreros ilustrados to think about intellectuals from the working classes. And so one of the things that using that concept allowed me to do beyond working class intellectuals or organic intellectuals is to look at the ways that these intellectuals from the working classes often negotiated multiple identities. So being a worker was not the sole identity that they carried. Some of them saw themselves as journalists, as poets, as painters, as littérateurs, playwrights, etc., etc., etc. And so I leave it to the reader to ask, were these folks workers that were enlightened or enlightened individuals that had to work, or is there a division between that? Should we think about them separately, or is it one sole thing? So it was also, and I know that Josian is more from a Marxist tradition than I am, but it was also a provocation on class understandings of working class history in Puerto Rico.
Thank you, Jorell. Ralph Vega Jr. has a comment rather than question, but I'm just going to read it so that his voice is heard. It's important that any exclusions that took place in our history, and obviously from what you have described so far, this is something that continues even to this day. It's important that they not be left out of our historical narrative. Thank you, Ralph. My colleagues, Matthew and Celiani, fellow research associates here at Centro, they each have a question. So Matthew asks, I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little about how or where you found the archive, or the archives, I suppose, especially when official archives and historiographies have both silenced and or erased many of the historical actors that you study. How does your work redefine and or challenge how we think about the archives? Y voy a leer la de Celiani rapidito because we are short on time, and it's actually a pretty simple question. ¿Cómo ves la diferencia entre barriadas y parcelas? Te pregunto porque el término parceleras recientemente has become politicized. And there's a link there, which I'm going to put in the chat in case people want to check it out. So you can take those questions in whatever order you prefer.
Super, thank you. So in the interest of time, I will try to be succinct, pero if I speak too fast, please let me know. So thank you. In terms of archives, there's two ways to answer that question. I think that in terms of physical repositories and material archives, it was a challenge because, you know, in Puerto Rico, and this is something that we all can attest to, there's not a, archives are, you know, in a precarious condition. They've been in a precarious condition for a while now. You know, after the 2006 recession and economic crisis, fiscal crisis, archives are not at the top of the list of government, you know, of the government agenda. Thus, working in archives, in any sort of archives, is a challenge, more so if you're doing working class history. So the archive that I consulted was el Centro de Documentación Obrera Santiago Iglesias Pantin in UPR Humacao. And I've said this a couple of times and I'll continue saying it. It is a shame and it's sad and it breaks my heart that if I wanted to write this book today, I could not do it because that archive was partly destroyed or completely destroyed. We don't know what happened to the archive after Hurricane Maria in 2017. Since then, it has not opened. Since then, they have not moved the collections from inside. So we don't know what was there before because it was never cataloged, and so we will never know what we lost. And so that's one part. So it was there that I conducted that research. In terms of non-material archives, I think that's a very important question, because one of the things that happened in Puerto Rican historiography is that although in the 1970s we started looking at history from below, la historia de abajo, we did not look to the sides. And so one of the things that this is not a critique, but it's one of the things that I argue that happened is that 1970s historiography did not question the archives that they were engaging with. And so hence they reproduce the master codes that these obreros ilustrados had created at the turn of the 20th century, hence reproducing some silences, erasures, and whatnot. And it was not until more recently, for example, with the work of Eileen Finley, Ileana Rodriguez Silva, who I saw on the call, Maria del Carmen Baerga, who began rethinking that archive. So that work had been done before me, and I'm just trying to continue that sort of interrogation into the archive. Ultimately, I'm trying to challenge el archivo de la puertorriqueñidad, and that's something that we can go on about in another conversation. But in terms of parcelas, boom, Jose, and you mentioned that's a simple question for me. When I read it, I was like sweating. I was like, how am I going to address that? Because I think it's crucial because, okay, I'm going to try to take a stab at it. The concept of the lettered barriada is used as a metaphor to study this cluster of working class intellectuals that I engage with in the book. I think that earlier on in the conversation with Jose, I was mentioning that I did not know how to use what metaphor to use to those that were in the margins of the margins. And I think that parcelas could be that concept because in early 20th century Puerto Rico, parcelas were not as predominant as barriadas, historically speaking. But I think that the folks that inhabit the parcelas were the folks that were erased from that archive. Non-skilled workers, agricultural workers, Black folks, women, that is the majority of the Puerto Rican population. And so that's one of the things that I've been wanting to get at. So ultimately, this question led me to think about how when we think about labor history in Puerto Rico, we often think about a small group of workers that dominated the means of knowledge production, but it's not representative of the majority of Puerto Ricans, which possibly inhabited the lettered parcelas. So thank you for that.
Great, thank you, Jorell. We have a couple of more really interesting questions. So I'm gonna skip over a few that have to do with the archive, and which I think you kind of answered in your last question. Here's one from Maria Josefa Canino Arroyo. She asked, can you comment briefly on relationships among anarchists in Puerto Rico and Puerto Rican communists and labor leaders and intellectuals in New York, like when Bernardo Vega, Jesus Colón, and so on in the early 20th century?
Claro, un abrazo, Maria Josefa. Gracias por la pregunta. So yes, absolutely. I think that, when we think about the workers that I'm following in the book, they were part of a broader transnational community. And New York was a node within that community. Also, La Habana was really important in this circulation of knowledge. And I think that New York, particularly after 1917, in which it was easier for Puerto Ricans to travel back and forth, became an important node. The most radical sector of the working classes were the tobacco sector, tobacco rovers, tobacco workers, tabaqueros, tabacaleros. And there was an important community in New York City. And so there was a lot of exchange. So for example, it was not uncommon for Ángel María Dieba, an anarchist, to publish in Cultura Obrera, which was published out of New York, right? And so there was a lot of cross-pollination, a lot of collaboration and solidarity. Bernardo Vega is a fascinating case. He was a founding member of the Socialist Party in 1915. He lived in New York. We have that amazing memorias that Cesar Andrés Iglesias did whatever he wanted with them, but that are there as an archive. He came back as a militant and MPI. So yes, there's a lot of collaboration between anarchists, communists, and radicals in Puerto Rico and Nueva York. The only thing I would say is that in terms of communism in Puerto Rico and in New York, it is a later phenomenon. So the Communist Party in Puerto Rico, if I'm not mistaken, was in 1934, September 23, el aniversario del grito, that was created. So before that, anarchists were more predominant in radical discourses. So absolutely, there was a lot of communication between Nueva York, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the broader region.
Thank you, Jorell, and we have time for one more question, and you should try to be brief, and it's actually a pretty complex question.
Okay,
so,
okay.
Silvia Álvarez pregunta, ¿puedes hablar un poco sobre los trasvases entre esta barriada y la otra, la de la ciudad, para que no se vea como un binarismo, a pesar de que esa no sea tu intención? So I guess the intermingling between la ciudad letrada y la barriada letrada, what are the points of contact between them?
¿Puedo contestar en español o contesto en inglés, José?
Contesta en español. I think we have interpreters.
Estupendo.
I mean, we contesta en español, and I'll do a little bit of an English.
Oh, I'll translate. I'll do it in English, just to keep the same track. Silvia, un abrazo también. Gracias por la pregunta. Yes, I think it's important to go beyond that binary, and thank you for that provocation and opening to explain. I think that it was more porous than we think about. These obreros ilustrados were in contact with people from the elite. And I'm thinking about the ways that they would engage with Mariano Abril, with other folks from the lettered city. And also one of the things that I want to argue in the book, and I think this is where one of the important divisions between the city and La Barriada, is that these obreros ilustrados eventually became part of Puerto Rico's political spheres. They became respected politicians. They were entering spaces of power in Washington and San Juan. However, I think that the strike at the University of Puerto Rico highlights the ways that they were not seen as intellectuals. And so that way, I think that's important. And I think that your question also moves towards an exploration into the physical barriadas and ciudad, because a lot of these workers inhabited the same spaces physically as those that inhabited the lettered city. And so thank you for the question, because I think that it was not a binary. It was porous, but there were some exclusions, right? And I'm thinking about Mariano Abril. It always comes to mind because he has a famous, not famous, a really interesting phrase in El Socialismo Moderno, in which he says that Puerto Rican socialists do not understand socialism because they only have these rustic newspapers and rustic libraries in which they read about socialism. And so when I first read that, I was enraged, but he was quite right. These obreros ilustrados only had a few newspapers and rustic libraries. But yeah, so it's not a binary. It is porous, but there were some exclusions. And so one of the arguments that I make in the book is that they were allowed entrance into spaces of powers because of their identities as politicians, not because of their identities as intellectuals.
Excellent. Thank you, Jorell. I think that's pretty much all the time that we have. I want to thank everybody for being here with us. Jorell, again, thank you for so generously giving us of your time and for this wonderful book that, like I said, I'm sure it's going to be a great tool for many of us for years to come. I want to, before we go, I want to remind everybody that Centro does have a library lunch hour next week. And I have the, yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not being able to open the link because Zoom, oh, okay, here we go.
Chat. It's okay.
Okay, Kimberly put it in the tab. Thank you, Kimberly. So yeah, join us for the library lunch hour next February 22nd. That's Tuesday at noon. And again, thank you to everybody. Thank you especially to Jorell. And take care and stay tuned for some great public programming from Centro in the coming weeks.
Gracias a todos.
Gracias, Jorell.